Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are continuing our unit guide series for bolt action, and having just capped off our howitzer weapon profiles, we are now going to move on and take a look at another unique artillery piece, which is of course the nefarious multiple launcher. And this weapon profile is used to represent some of the various early rocket batteries that were deployed in the Second World War, and were much more crude than the various rocket and missile systems that we have today. To describe it in a very generalized manner, basically you had a large rack where the rockets would be launched from to saturate large areas with explosive ordnance. And in bolt action, this weapon profile is designed to do exactly that on the tabletop, as it is one of the few weapons in bolt action that can hit multiple units at the same time. But let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at the multiple rocket launcher weapon profile, as it is one of the more unique artillery pieces in the game, and will come in at 65 points on average if you run them as regulars, which, as we will see, is a very fair price point for a unit with this magnitude of firepower. However, multiple launchers are also very viable when run as an inexperienced unit, more so than most other units in bolt action, as they are indirect fire weapons that aren't impacted by that -1 hit modifier. And while you could say the same thing for units like mortars, mortars are often restricted from taking spotters when run as inexperienced. But with the exception of a few units like the Soviet M30, multiple launchers tend to not have access to things like spotters. And all these things combined really mitigate the drawbacks of taking them as inexperienced, which can definitely be done to save you a few points in your list. In fact, of all units in bolt action, I would say multiple launchers are the ones that suffer the least drawbacks from being inexperienced overall. On top of that, we are going to see a very large points fluctuation between different multiple launcher units, as they tend to dramatically vary in crew size, which usually comes in at about 5 points per model. So, while a unit like the German Howling Cow may only have 2 models in the unit, it is more common to see 3 or 4 crew members, with some outliners even having 5 men. Now, these crews will of course suffer a -1 morale penalty when you get down to the last man. However, as an indirect fire weapon, you're never going to be suffering that -1 to hit that you usually would with other weapon crews when they get down to their last man. After that, the multiple launcher is going to be a fixed weapon, meaning you will be able to pivot on an advance order, something that again is not going to have any innate drawbacks on the multiple launcher, as you are an indirect fire weapon that can never hit better than a 6. So at this point you guys are probably starting to see a pattern here with the multiple launcher, as it is very much liberated from those painful hit modifiers, which traditionally bog down a lot of different weapon profiles and prevent them from being viable. But going back to the fixed keyword, we are also going to be able to make run orders and relocate these units up to 6 inches, which is very good for shaking things like mortars who really like to zero in on artillery pieces. And next up we are going to have the multiple launcher special rule, which really informs how this weapon is played and gives it its character. And as we will see, this weapon is going to count as a heavy mortar, with the caveat that its chances of hitting never get better than a roll of 6. However, all enemy units within 6 inches of your initial target will also have the chance of being hit by this weapon, provided that they are not within this weapon's minimum range. And it is worth noting that those 6 inches are measured from the edge of your initial template, not from its center, and all that essentially means is that all enemy units within a 10-inch radius will have an attack dice rolled against them, and on a roll of a 6, they will be hit by a 3-inch high explosive weapon. And that basically makes multiple launchers a high explosive slot machine that turns your table into a crapshoot. If your enemy is bunched up, you can potentially score a lot of hits, and your opponent is going to be holding their breath as you roll 1d6 after another. A few things also worth mentioning here. The first is that this is an indirect fire weapon, meaning you will be hitting enemy vehicles on their top armor, giving it a +1 penetration modifier, which at +4 penetration is equivalent to that of a light anti-tank gun, and will get a +1 roll to the damage table if you are hitting an open-topped vehicle. But also, it is worth noting that these high explosive templates do not overlap and clip other units. They are only used to determine how many models in a single unit are hit, so the same unit can't be hit by 3 different 3-inch high explosive profiles due to a multiple launcher overlapping them 3 times as it hits other units. So, while the multiple launcher can only hit on a roll of 6, it is again one of the very few weapons in the game capable of hitting multiple units in one action, and it can punish your opponent immensely if they bunch up their units into one area, which is really good for controlling objective zones and also boards with dense choke points. But with that multiple launcher keyword summed up, we do have most of the weapon profile here spoiled for us, with really the only stat left to cover here being the range, that is a minimum of 12 inches to a maximum of 72, which is very generous not only in the overall distance, but also the minimum range being just 12 inches. And that 6-foot reach is going to be very advantageous in keeping this artillery piece alive. As I said earlier, they do often require line of sight, and if you do choose to run them as inexperienced, they are going to die easier, and also struggle to activate once they do start receiving pins. So the ability to deploy your multiple launcher out of harm's reach is critical to its success, once again, especially if you are running them as inexperienced. So overall, I gotta say, the multiple launcher is a highly effective weapon profile capable of delivering multiple HE shots in a single activation, one that can punish both vehicles and infantry alike, and is really going to shine against opponents who either field large quantities of units or like to bunch his forces up on the battlefield. And coming in anywhere between low 40s to high 60s in terms of points cost, you really only need to score 1 or 2 good hits throughout the course of a match for this unit to make its points back, and a good multiple launcher barrage can shut down entire armies with pin markers alone. And because of all that, I'm definitely hesitant to argue that multiple launchers aren't OP, though I do think the main issue with them is their incredibly low points cost, as they are still a rather unreliable unit that your opponent can play against by spreading out his forces, and they're also not extremely durable. And I think if they were brought up to the 90 to 100 point range, they would be a little bit more balanced, as they would have to work a bit harder to get those sweet hits to make their points back. As it currently stands, you really only need to score 1 hit by rolling a 6 on something like a medium vehicle or a veteran infantry squad, and you've already made a pretty good trade up in points. However, things do get a little bit more complex when you start looking at multiple launchers mounted on vehicles, as they are not only incredibly rare, but also tend to lose some of their points efficiency. There are vehicles like the Sherman Calliope, or Calliope, however you want to say it, that bundle multiple launchers into your standard medium tank, and at that point, the overall points cost for that single activation just doesn't really pan out. Instead, multiple launchers on vehicles seem most at home on those lighter chassis that remain points efficient while still giving your units a little bit more maneuverability and protection. And the obvious poster child for this description is of course going to be the Russian Katyusha, which is incredibly affordable at just 64 points inexperienced and 80 points as regular. However, I am definitely a bit more partial to things like the Panzerwerfer 42, which elevates your armor value of that 6+ soft skinned, which can get penned by small arms fire, to the half-tracks 7+ armor value, which really does go a long way in terms of protection. However, the major problem with taking these multiple launcher vehicles is the fact that they usually fit into that armored slot in your reinforced platoon, which, as we all know, is more traditionally used for things like medium tanks that give you a little bit more backbone to your overall force, and sacrificing something like a Panzer IV for a Panzerwerfer can be a bit of a risk-reward scenario. Yes, you could layer 2 multiple launchers into a single list in the artillery and armored slot, and I could definitely see matches where you outright wipe your opponent's infantry off the table with back-to-back barrages. However, I could also see the scenario in which your opponent's Sherman simply blows up your Panzerwerfer with that 75mm gun, while simultaneously taking your Nebelwerfer off the table with a lucky hail of bullets from that medium machine gun on the hull. When it comes to things like that, bolt action is an incredibly swingy game, and a single crucial dice roll can impact the outcome of entire matches. So in the unique situation that is the multiple launcher, I do think it is actually better run as an artillery piece than mounted on a vehicle, though it's definitely by no means the worst use of that armored slot. And overall, if you are a bolt action player and your faction has access to a multiple launcher, I would highly recommend you pick one up, as they are incredibly fun to play and make for some really chair flipping moments. Just, if you want to keep your friends, maybe don't field it every match. But let me know what you guys think about the multiple launcher in the comment section down below. What's your favorite platform in which it appears? Is it an artillery piece? Is it on a vehicle? And go ahead and give me your highest kill count in a match with a multiple launcher, and how many years it took to mend the friendship with the person who it happened to. Personally, I really don't have as much as a problem with multiple launchers as I do with flamethrowers, and that might have to do more with the transport thing, but it's definitely up there in terms of bolt action cheese. As always, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you can see more entries in this unit guide series, and as always, until next time, take care.